Welcome all the students of class 10, parents, teachers and other viewers. You are now in the social science class. We are discussing the fourth part of the topic called Globalization and the Indian economy. In the previous three parts, we discussed about what are multinational companies, how multinational companies grow, how technology changed, how technology facilitates globalization. We also discussed about are there any different phases of globalization. We come to an understanding based on the scholars that globalization has three versions, three parts. We are now in the globalization version 3. And in this phase, it is the technology that facilitates, particularly those technologies associated with the satellite technologies and shipping technologies, transport technologies. I also suggested you to see analyze the commonalities and differences across three phases. If you wish to analyze the globalization process, which is nothing but integration of markets to produce goods and services and distribute across nations. Look at the screen. In our view, there are 4 dimensions related to globalization. Rather, we can call as globalization facilitators. It means how globalization is driven, what is most important for globalization process to happen. In the previous parts, we also discussed about technologies, various technologies. We also discussed about how multinational companies, how they grow, how they expand. But do you think that they can happen without role of people and government and so on? So if you look at the screen, you can see the 4 players, the World Trade Organization and government, about which we are going to discuss in this presentation. We are also going to see how people deal with globalization, because it may be beneficial to somebody, it may not be beneficial to few others. We discussed that multinational companies across countries, they set up their units, they establish, and their main motivation is to produce at a low cost using sophisticated technologies and also sell at prices which can earn them profits. We also discussed about how East India Company was able to travel all over the world, how East India Company colonized India, took away the raw materials from here, and produced finished products. Let us now discuss about governments. For many centuries, government did not have any role to play in the economic activities of people. They used to tax people. That's called laissez-faire. You will know more about in higher classes. Whereas in the process of globalization, governments play many crucial, important roles. What are those roles actually? Government formulate policies. So, in order to drive the globalization process, governments formulate liberalization policies. What it means to be liberalization policies? This means you know that production can happen by a company. It is not the government, it is not the people. It is the individual entities, companies produce goods and services, sell goods and services, export and import goods and services. So for these purposes, government has to formulate laws. So when the government is taxing, if they put more taxes, that means companies may not be interested in producing more because they will not get more profit if the government is taxing. If the government is putting ban on import and export, you may be knowing in the newspaper that whenever there is a sudden rise in prices of certain goods like onion or like pulses, suddenly government ban the export of goods. So the government has a regulation over all the economic activities today. For example, in 1940s and more than 60 years time, many countries, including India, did not encourage import of goods. They encouraged companies to produce within India. Even today also the government of India is promoting with a new slogan called Make in India. So the government encouraged companies to produce locally. That's called import substitution policies. The third aspect is removing trade barriers. For example, many times what happened, governments put a condition that you need to import only small quantities or specific quantities. Or sometimes they tax, the government can tax more. For example, 30 years before, if you want to buy a television from say England and bring it to India, and you may be buying say in Indian rupees say about 10,000 rupees, but if you come to India, in the airport, the government will ask you to pay taxes of say 20,000 rupees. So obviously when you come to India, the television costs 30,000 rupees. So this type of taxing is called import duty. This is also one of the trade barriers. So the government did not allow to import goods. That's one way to facilitate or stop globalization process. So in the globalization 3.0, government did many activities. Governments, not only India, many countries, and we are discussing in the Indian context today, that government formulated globalization policies. Government removed the trade barriers. For example, today you are getting apples and many fruits and vegetables from other countries, which was not the case earlier. Even 20 years before, you cannot import apples. Today you can import. Same way, many commodities you are able to import today. That is because the government has removed the trade barriers on import. Government also built infrastructure. For example, today government, like most of the roads are built by the government. Today the most electricity that you get in your houses and in the offices, in your schools, they are all produced by the government. Government built hospitals, government built schools, government built roads, government run transports like corporation buses. So all these are called basic infrastructure. So this is also done by the government. Government also encourage competition. For example, when new companies set up their units in India, I already discussed with you that that will lead to competition. These days, government also attract, for example, many prime ministers, they travel to other countries. Even the chief ministers of many states, they'll travel to other countries, invite investors to come to invest in India, in their own state or country as a whole. So it has become very customary that prime ministers used to go and encourage investors to come to India and invest in India. That means the foreign direct investment in India to set up factories, to set up institutions, to set up like many more service activities. So this requires government to amend the laws related to industry, commerce, labor, environment and land. This is the way government facilitates globalization process, by relaxing the laws, by building infrastructure. I already discussed with you about how technology is facilitated. So I am not discussing more about it, but I can list out few things. For example, industrial revolution, transportation, particularly roadways, shipping, railways, and other major driver is space technology, satellites and they help in information communication technologies, invention of computers, laptops, all the different computers that you are using or you are seeing in the offices. So they are all part of the technological change, and these are done by the multinational companies. Only the satellites are launched by the governments. Otherwise, the transport, I already told you that government build transport facilities like roads and run buses, railways and so on. The other major facilitator is called World Trade Organization. Before 1940s, or for example after the World War, we know that all the countries cannot produce all the goods and services that we wanted. We have to depend on each other for various purposes. This is called free trade, allowing companies to import and export goods and services. So what happened? The countries all came together in 1940s. They set up an agreement called General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. You will know more about in higher classes. I am just giving you a simple example that governments came together, they formulated certain rules and regulations of how we can engage in foreign trade, how we can allow companies to engage in buying and selling of goods from other countries. If it happens between two countries, that is called bilateral trade. For example, if India is engaged in purchase of onion from Pakistan, and if these two countries are engaged in trade, that is called bilateral trade. If these two countries are signing an agreement, so that is called bilateral trade agreement. If more than two countries are coming and sitting in a table to get engaged in trade activities, that is called multilateral trade. So these agreements were signed in 1940s on the basis of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. In 1990s, what happened? All these countries thought of establishing an institution, an organization called World Trade Organization. So this organization, look at this website. You can see that website. It contains very interesting details about how WTO is functioning. The World Trade Organization was set up in Geneva as its headquarters in 1995. The difference between the United Nations organizations and the WTO is that in United Nations organization, not all the countries are having equal power. For example, there are countries which are having veto power, whereas in World Trade Organizations, all the countries are having equal power and they can cast one vote each. So the World Trade Organization facilitate the trading between across countries. So what happened in the World Trade Organization? Look at the picture. This is called ministerial meetings. This means the officials of the governments of all the countries, they come together, they formulate laws to trade goods and services. What happens in WTO? As I told you earlier, they formulate laws on how to import and export goods and services among countries. They also facilitate member countries to formulate multilateral or bilateral trade agreements. They also decide how much tariff, how much tax has to be levied on goods and services which are exported, imported across countries. If there are dispute between two countries with regard to export and import, this dispute is settled at the tables of WTO. They come together, they formulate, they come to an understanding. The establishment of WTO and the functioning of WTO is been critically examined by the scholars. Some scholars report that WTO is not helping developing countries, rather they encourage or they support all the laws formulated in WTO, they help only developed countries. So it is necessary that you can read more about how the WTO functions, who its benefits in higher classes. But there are many issues which are remain to be settled in the area of export and imports. So WTO is the major driver of globalization, and many countries are depending on it actually. When it affects specific section of people, they go for protests and marches. For example, few years before, people protested against the WTO because it affected the conditions of labor. Let me come to the other issue, that how globalization impacts India. So far we have discussed about what are the facilitators of globalization. We discussed about how multinational companies function, how government facilitates globalization, how WTO facilitates globalization. We also looked at how technologies facilitated globalization. Now let us look at it. Has it benefited India? Has it impacted in India? You need to develop arguments based on the evidences that you are going to read in your textbook and other books. But the following are the important pointers that you need to keep in mind when you want to analyze the impact of globalization. Scholars say that it has led to increase in foreign investment. For example, in 1991, when India introduced new policies, new economic policies, liberalization policies, it did not have sufficient foreign exchange to buy even petrol. So today we have a sufficient amount of foreign exchange because many people came, invested in India. Many foreign companies, MNCs, they set up their own factories. They start producing, selling goods in India. And they also sold outside India. So it has led to foreign investment in India. So it has benefited, scholars say. You also notice that in the last 30 years, you may be very young, but if you ask your parents, elderly people, you will come to know that the globalization in India has led to establishment of many cities, industrial hubs. They are called special economic zones. For example, there are many export processing zones established in different parts of India. Gurugram, Tripur, Bangalore are some examples of cities where industrial activities have increased tremendously over the last 3 decades. You will also notice that many companies are coming, selling the same products. For example, television, you will see many companies, many products are available. In computers, many companies are selling their goods. In case of many other consumer goods also, you get variety. That means the companies compete with each other. So the competition has increased. The competition between the larger companies, the competition between the smaller company and larger companies. It is also said that globalization has led to sustainable development, the erosion of the land soil. It has led to groundwater depletion. It has led to high amount of pollution. Scholars, they do bring out evidences. The globalization also in the last 30 years in India has led to establishment and growth of multinational companies within India. Many Indians have become billionaires. They set up their own units. For example, Reliance India Limited, Wipro, Infosys, and many companies one can cite as examples of new MNCs in the last 20 years. It is also said that the globalization has led to more of a service-driven change in the economy. It is the service activities that has increased. It is also said that the globalization did not benefit workers on a large scale. It has affected agriculture because the government has diverted the investment from agriculture to service activities. It has been argued. Globalization also led to hundreds and thousands of companies getting closed. I already discussed with you in the previous part about how small juice making companies got closed, how they were purchased by the giant MNCs. It is also argued that the nature of employment in the globalization 3.0 is very, very highly fragile, and it is far from expectations. The employment survey conducted in the last 4 decades shows that the employment is not growing in our country. Whereas it's also argued that many young people with skills and capital are able to get required technological skills. They grab new opportunities and they live in urban areas. That's the one set of argument. It's also argued that the consumers get very good quality goods and services today due to globalization. You need to decide. You can cite evidences, analyze for yourself that how far all these arguments are true. Let me sum it up. If you look at all 3 phases, how people dealt with globalization. If these are the impacts, how people have dealt with that. In the phase 1 and 2, we know that the slavery was there in the globalization phase 1. It was abolished. Many countries which were colonized during the globalization phase 2, they became free nations. Of course, it took 200 years, 300 years for countries, some countries. Globalization also people dealt with by fighting as part of Swadeshi movement. They followed protectionism. In countries like India, public sector companies were established in 1960s and 70s, and trade restrictions were laid by the independent democratic countries. Today, people deal with globalization through international organizations like ILO, International Labour Organization, or through United Nations Organization, and with the help of civil society organizations. Many times when the governments go to the tables of WTO for trade negotiations, people pressurize the government so that the farmers and the people who are in the vulnerable sections are not affected. This is the way people have been dealing with globalization. With this, let me come to the end of this discussion on the theme globalization and the Indian economy. You can recall what we discussed in the part 1, what are the concepts that we intended to discuss. I hope that we discussed all these concepts. Let me list these concepts, and if you can clarify yourselves. For example, the concepts imports, exports, investment, foreign trade, profits, sustainable development, outsourcing, liberalization, subcontracting, competition, global supply chain. We also discussed free trade practices, what is creative destruction, multilateral trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements. It is time now to review and assess the discussion points. Let me read out the statements. You can write true, false, not sure, or maybe. Statement 1. Liberalization means government allowing only imports of goods and services. Statement number 2. Outsourcing helps MNCs to reduce cost. Statement number 3. Globalization of the present ones, version 3.0, is possible due to satellite technology. Statement number 4. When a company from one country set up its factory in another country, it means it has made foreign investment in that country. Statement number 5. When the government reduced customs duty on a particular imported commodity, it means it has reduced the trade barrier. Statement number 6. Multilateral trading system is an important dimension of globalization. Statement number 7. Restricting the import of commodity is one form of trade barrier. Let me summarize the theme of globalization and the Indian economy. We discussed about what is globalization, how multinationals, companies, governments, technology and WTO, World Trade Organization, facilitated globalization, how it is enacted, what are their phases, who benefits, who loses in the process of globalization. You can read more details in higher classes. Thank you.